Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe was even a thought, before Spider-Man swung onto the big screen, and before the X-Men had their Hollywood debut, Marvel characters were being licensed out for next to nothing. Many of you may not know this, but in the 1980s and early 90s, Hollywood saw superhero films as risky investments, and because Marvel was struggling financially, they were more than willing to sell the film rights to its lesser-known characters for whatever studios were willing to pay. And that's how we got 1989's The Punisher, a forgotten relic of the era, starring Dolph Lundgren as the ruthless vigilante Frank Castle. Unlike the comic book-inspired blockbusters of today, The Punisher had no colorful costumes, no larger-than-life villains, and no real connection to its comic book roots beyond the name. Instead, it played out like a standard 80s action film, filled with gritty shootouts, grimy underworld dealings, and a brooding, revenge-driven protagonist. In fact, the movie was Punisher only in spirit and was actually considered more Death Wish than Daredevil. While the film was never given a proper theatrical release in the US, it found a second life in home video markets and became something of a cult curiosity for die-hard fans of Marvel's most brutal anti-hero. It's a product of its time, soaked in the neon-lit grime of late 80s action filmmaking, where bad guys were disposable, heroes spoke in growls, and explosions solved just about everything. It may not have been the Punisher film fans dreamed of, but for a low-budget straight-to-video adaptation made when Marvel was licensing out its heroes for pennies, it's a fascinating piece of comic book movie history. With that being said, let's not waste another moment, and let's take a gander at what this 80s forgotten film was all about. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The first Punisher movie explored. Frank Castle was once a dedicated undercover cop, a family man, and someone who believed in the system, but that was before the mob took everything from him. 5 years ago, a car bomb meant for him killed his wife and 2 daughters, reducing his world to ashes. On that night, Frank Castle died, and in his place, the Punisher was born. For half a decade, the criminal underworld has lived in fear of a relentless, unseen force. Over 125 mobsters had been slaughtered, their deaths linked only by a whispered name, the Punisher, whose work is well known by the signature use of special throwing knives engraved with a skull. Meanwhile, the police have no leads, and the media calls him a myth. But to those who run the streets, he is all too real. Somewhere beneath the city, deep in the labyrinth of tunnels and sewers, Frank Castle lives in exile, where his only companion in this one-man war is an eccentric, washed-up stage actor named Shake, a homeless man who speaks in riddles and rhymes, but provides valuable intel. Shake may be odd, but he knows the city's pulse, and right now, let's just say, it's pounding with fear. When Frank is not shortening the list of crime lords in the city, he's hiding in the sewers, meditating and asking God why the innocent suffer and the guilty go unpunished. Over time, he has come to see himself as an instrument of God's will, in taking down those wicked few that the law cannot. Naturally, Frank's relentless war has taken its toll on the mob. Their power was crumbling and their ranks were decimated as crime boss Dino Moretti, who at the moment was at the top of the chain, scrambled to hold things together. During this time, the underworld families had become so weakened by the Punisher's guerrilla warfare that Kingpin or Mafia boss Gianni Franco was forced out of his retirement. Eventually, it's also revealed that Franco is the guy who ordered the car bomb that killed Castle's entire family. Anyways, Gianni Franco has returned to the United States to unite the various decimated Italian families of New York into one cohesive crime empire after the Punisher's rampage left a power vacuum that many were eager to film. But on the eve of Franco's attempt to unite the New York mob, suddenly, a gang of ninja sabotaged a massive heroin deal, and just when he was about to help the mafia regain their control on the city, the infamous Yakuza leader, Lady Tanaka, arrived to take advantage of the mafia's weakness and set herself up as the new crime lord of New York City. Under the cold and ruthless Lady Tanaka, the Japanese crime syndicate seizes the opportunity to move in on what's left of the mafia's empire. When Moretti, desperate to keep his power, refuses to submit, Tanaka makes an example of him. She and her men storm his casino, massacre his guards, and slit his throat. So, just like that, the Italian mafia, who was once untouchable, is forced to its knees. However, to fully establish her superiority over the Italian mob bosses, Lady Tanaka had a plan, and so she decided to take over the mafia families and all of their interests. In order to make the remaining mob bosses her subordinates and sway their men to her cause, Tanaka kidnapped their children, and using them as leverage, she left the crime lords with no choice but to surrender to her and follow her orders. Naturally, most of them bent their knees at her will, and were willing to follow Tanaka's rule if it meant keeping their families alive. But there was one guy who refused to play along, and that was Gianni Franco. Now, Franco had been out of the game, living in Europe for years, but with his own allies falling and his own son Tommy in Tanaka's hands, he had no choice but to step back in, and this time he was out for blood. Now, during this time, Frank Castle keeps to his one-man war, striking at whatever criminal operations he can, and after learning about the war between the Italian mob and Japanese crime syndicate, he simply decides to sit back and let them kill each other. But one day, when Shake approaches him with new information, he learns that this was not just another gang power struggle because the Yakuza were targeting children, and that changes everything. By this point, Lady Tanaka had kidnapped the children of all major mafia figures in the city and planned to sell them into the Arab slave trade. Castle never really cared much about wiping out the mob, and for him, it was never about power struggles or territory, but revenge. But children? That's not a line he was willing to let anyone cross. So, the Punisher eventually rides into battle against the Yakuza and attacks all their businesses, warning them that every day the children are gone will cost them money. The Yakuza later capture the Punisher and Shake and attempt to torture them into submission. But somehow, the Punisher breaks free and decides that the only course of action was a direct rescue. He is able to save most of the children and commandeer a bus to get the kidnapped kids to safety. But Tommy Franco, the son of Gianni Franco, was taken away to the Yakuza headquarters prior to Frank Castle beginning his rescue mission. Anyways, while Frank Castle was driving the bus with the rest of the children, he was intercepted by the police, and so, after he released all the kids, the cops arrested him. For the first time in 5 years, Frank Castle was back in the hands of the police. His former partner, Jake Berkowitz, had been obsessed with catching him, as he was the only one who was convinced that Frank was still alive despite official reports declaring him dead, and was now a self-styled vigilante. His new partner, Detective Sam Leary, also believed in justice, but even she has to admit that Castle might be the only thing keeping the city from being completely overrun by criminals. Still, they both team up to prove that Frank Castle and the Punisher are one and the same. Unfortunately, the interrogation doesn't go anywhere, as Castle remains unshaken. When his old partner warns him about how his multiple killings will likely get him executed, Frank remains ambivalent to it, stating that the Frank he knew was already dead, and now he was just the Punisher. Now, Frank knew that the cops could not hold him forever, as no prison was strong enough to hold the Punisher, and when the time would come, he would eventually make his escape. Soon afterwards, Franco personally comes to him with an offer to take down the Yakuza and breaks Frank out of prison in order to seek his help in saving his son from whatever the Japanese crime syndicate had planned for Tommy Franco. After expressing his heartfelt regret for the bomb killing Castle's entire family, Franco assures him that he would leave the city for good after rescuing his son, but given that the Punisher despises Franco and everything he stands for, he insists that after they are done with the Yakuza, Franco would die at his hands. The two then set their uneasy truce and infiltrate Tanaka's stronghold, cutting through her men in a brutal, fast-paced assault. But Lady Tanaka is no ordinary crime boss. She's meticulous and always one step ahead, and that is how she had her horde of ninjas ready to counter any attack. With no more time to waste, Castle and Franco mount an all-out assault on the Yakuza headquarters because this time there was no room for failure. The two men, along with Franco's soldiers, stormed the building in a relentless firefight. Even though the Yakuza's elite warriors put up a fierce resistance, Castle easily cuts through them with brutal efficiency. He also kills Tanaka's bodyguard, her adoptive daughter, in a fight. As they eventually reach the main hall, they finally find Franco's son, Tommy. But before they can escape, Lady Tanaka makes her move and wields her signature hidden blades with deadly precision. When Frank overpowers her, Tanaka's life is initially spared, but when her enemy turns his back to her, she tries to kill him with a hidden knife. But Frank Castle is faster and viciously reacts by throwing his knife to her forehead, thus killing her over instantly and ending the Yakuza's reign in the city. Finally, Franco was reunited with his son, but instead of being grateful to the Punisher for his help, he decides to betray Frank when his guards are down. But this fatal mistake costs Franco quite a lot. He just assumed that Frank Castle's war was over and believed that just because they fought side by side, he was safe. But the Punisher doesn't make deals. The mob still had blood on its hands, and Franco was no different than the men he had spent years hunting, especially given how Franco was the reason Frank lost his family and his old life in the first place. In a final brutal confrontation, the Punisher kills Franco when the latter attacks him, thus leaving Tommy, his young son, to witness it all firsthand. Seeing his father dead, Tommy then threatens the Punisher for murdering Franco, but just could not bring himself to take his revenge and simply breaks down. As Tommy sobs, Castle kneels before him, not as a monster, but as a man who understands loss better than anyone. He asks Tommy to grow up to be a good man instead of following his father's misdeeds before vanishing into the night. By the time the police arrive at the scene, they find absolutely no trace of the Punisher. Meanwhile, somewhere beneath the streets, Frank Castle sharpens his knives, reloads his guns, and prepares for the next battle. The war isn't over. It never will be, because as long as crime exists, the Punisher will be there to make sure people are punished for their sins. Why does the first Punisher film deserve a second chance? When people talk about Marvel's biggest misfires over the years, the 1989 Punisher is often an easy target, right up there with films like Howard the Duck, The Marvels, Dark Phoenix, and the also much debated Spider-Man 3. Critics and fans have called the first Punisher dull, goofy, lifeless, and a weak adaptation of the source material. But still, one of the biggest complaints was about how Dolph Lundgren never dons the Punisher's signature skull emblem, though if you look closely, the design does appear on the handles of his knives, not that it did much to win over the disappointed fans of that era. Now, in this film, aside from Frank Castle himself, none of the characters in the 1980s The Punisher come from the comics, but that is not necessarily a problem. Over the years, different writers have introduced their own sidekicks and enemies for Frank Castle, since he doesn't have a fixed supporting cast like most superheroes. He's the kind of character who can go after any criminal, no matter who they are. With that being said, some of his more famous comic book villains tend to be a little over the top and feels more suited for a Dick Tracy comic than a gritty 80s action movie. Still, in my opinion, the first Punisher film does a surprisingly good job of building its own cast of characters and giving each of them enough depth to stand out. There are 7 key players in the film, and while not all of their aces are fully realized with Sam Leary's story being heavily trimmed in editing, they each somehow have a clear role and backstory. Kim Miori is genuinely intimidating as Lady Tanaka, bringing a sharp, commanding presence to the film. Jeroen Krabe's Johnny Franco makes for a compelling, morally great counterpart to Frank Castle, adding a bit more depth than the usual one-note crime boss. Barry Otto plays Shake, a drunken former actor who now serves as Castle's informant and occasional comic relief. Even if he brings humor to the role, he never takes it so far that it feels ridiculous. Then there is Dolph Lundgren, who is surprisingly well cast as the Punisher. His naturally stoic presence fits Frank Castle's emotionless, broken persona, and even his sometimes stilted English delivery ends up working in the character's favor. Sure, there are moments where the performances feel a little flat or over the top, but for the most part, the cast holds their own, making the film more engaging than its reputation might suggest. But, if you ask me, one of the Punisher's biggest strengths was its set design. Even though it was the late 80s, each location feels distinct, giving every faction its own visual identity. Frank Castle operates out of a maze-like network of cold, gray sewer tunnels, reflecting his isolation and detachment from society. The Mafia's world, by contrast, is drenched in wealth, which was portrayed by white ornamental interiors that screamed luxury and power. Meanwhile, the Yakuza's hideout was steeped in traditional Japanese design, complete with sliding panels and an elegant decor. Visually, the film almost feels like a series of comic book panels with a pop art style that adds flair without going over the top. But what really makes the settings shine is how they are used in the action. The environments were not just used as backdrops, but they became a part of the fight. It's amazing how every scene takes full advantage of its surroundings, turning each location into a playground for destruction. Moreover, the action scenes were also surprisingly well shot, with clear, fluid movement that seamlessly switches between gunfights and brutal hand-to-hand combat. Plus, Dolph Lundgren handled most of his own stunts, and the film's martial arts sequences were performed by real fighters. Interestingly, the hand-to-hand combat wasn't choreographed in the traditional Hollywood sense, as back in the day, many of the Japanese martial artists considered stage fighting dishonorable, so they decided to go full contact while shooting these scenes. Furthermore, to prepare for the role, Lundgren even returned to the intense training regimen from his days as a karate champion, in order to add the feeling of authenticity of his fights. It was this level of detail which really made the action stand out, and for a lesser-known Marvel film, The Punisher really delivers some of the best fight scenes of any 80s action movie. The movie keeps a tight, fast-paced rhythm, kicking off with an explosive opening and never really letting up. The plot is always pushing forward, only pausing briefly before diving into the next big action sequence. It strikes a nice balance between the seriousness without being overly grim, or the pulpiness without tipping into outright silliness. I think if the release dates of the film had not clashed with Tim Burton's Batman, this film would actually have a fair chance at the box office. Unless you start comparing it to Jon Bernthal's Punisher, Dolph Lundgren's Punisher was a genuinely great action movie that did its best to capture the tone of its source material and protagonist in its own way. Unfortunately, the film never really found its audience, and the only version still in print is a DVD so old that it lists interactive menus as a special feature. But if you actually want to watch this forgotten gem, nothing beats the special edition Blu-ray from Umbrella Entertainment that features the original theatrical version along with a hard-to-find unrated cut. The holy grail of this edition is the addition of the Mark Goldblatt work print, which features the deleted 15-minute intro, which finally shows us the sequence that was shown on the back of the original DVD case. The work print is crude and it is unfinished in the respect that the original music hadn't been added yet, but the opening salvo definitely makes it a worthwhile watch. Although it does change the tighter pacing of the original version that was released, we get to see Lundgren's Frank Castle and Gossett's Jake Berkowitz interact more. We even see Castle as a cop and family man before his family is tragically murdered, thus sending him on the path to becoming the iconic and infamous instrument of punishment. So, if you're lucky enough to come across this extended version of the film, please give it a try. With that being said, have any of you watched this 1989 Punisher film? Do you think it's worth a second glance? Let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comment box below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe, and thanks everyone.